Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Damien, you're up this week.
Yes, sir.
So what are you bringing to the table today?
So I have brought a really cool report to the table for us to talk about today, which I'm really excited about. The report is called Transformative Justice Knows No Borders, Learning from Community-Based Responses to Harm Around the World. Mm-hmm. It was written by and produced by Melanie Brazzell from the What Really Makes Us Safe project. And for folks listening, you can find this resource on Interrupting Criminalization's website. The report is actually one of the many results of a virtual conference that took place last May called Practicing for an Abolitionist World. I kind of wish we would have gotten an invitation to this. It brought together restorative and transformative justice practitioners and abolitionists from all around the world. And it outlined some of the major lessons learned from that conference, as well as really incredible case studies of this work in action and in practice from places literally all around the world. The conference was organized by some really incredible folks. I don't know if you had a chance to look at the list. Mm-hmm. Miriam Cabo was on the list, Andrea Ritchie. So again, that's why I'm a little jelly we didn't get an invitation. I think it probably was a really impactful experience for all those attendees. But at the core of this report, I think, are the lessons we can learn from the global response to a question that Melanie poses early on in the report, which is this. If abolitionist analysis shows us how death-making powers are linked internationally and intersectionally like a monster with many tentacles, how do we thread together our varied forms of resistance to fight back? And, when you think about it, and certainly when you read this report, I think there's so much to that statement, that question. Yeah. There's so much in the way of state-sanctioned violence and interpersonal violence taking place all around the world. And this report is a real resource. It's an incredible resource to and for organizers in lessons on how to effectively develop and utilize what Melanie refers to in this report as networks of care infrastructures and transnational networks of resistance, really in hopes of our collective liberation. So there's so much in this report. Yeah. there are a lot of pages, a lot of great content in this report. And so, I was like, there's so much that we could talk about. But yeah, where do you want to start? What did you think of it?
Yeah, I thought this was a great resource to learn more about what people are doing around the world. Yes. And they talked about how the concepts of transformative justice and abolition are really created in the West, in the United States, mm-hmm. and people have different contexts for what the state looks like outside of that. So there's some translation that people were having to do of, we don't use that terminology, we use this.
Right.
And so people figuring out the way that they approach this work is different. The way that they approach it's similar, but how they talk about it might be different.
Absolutely.
And so there's a little bit of trying to figure that out and some language challenges with people speaking different languages.
Right.
And they also talked about the challenge with hosting this and getting it started, organizing it from the United States and the imperial core, and using English as a foundational language for that, and what that means for colonization and echoes of colonization, all those things.
Yes.
So it was a really great report that dived into a lot of the intricacies of all of the things happening in the world, all the dynamics around colonization and white supremacy and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But I really appreciated the case studies and the questions that each case study raised.
Yeah. One
of the key takeaways for me was from the Abolition group, which is from the Philippines, and they have to operate informally because, quote, the Philippine government passed an anti-terrorism law that labels anyone who criticizes the state as a terrorist.
Right.
So they have to operate informally or they'll be labeled as terrorists and most likely thrown in prison. And this raised some questions at the end of their case study that were in the report. And those were, quote, what does informality enable and what does it restrict? Under what conditions can or should an underground decentralized movement emerge above ground? And what does it take to do that safely? So those are really, really pertinent questions because when you operate informally, sometimes that means you can't set group norms for how you want to operate.
Yeah, there's some challenges there. Right.
which means that the mainstream way of operating can sneak in because of the way we're socialized. And so
Yes.
some of the things that we're trying to combat can sneak in because we
Yep.
don't have a way to formally say, this is how we're going to do this.
Absolutely.
And talk about it in a transparent way. And there's ways to mitigate that, obviously, but it made me think about some of the challenges that you might face having to operate informally because of this law that the Philippine government passed. And I learned about this sort of concept, this idea, from an article by Joe Freeman called The Tyranny of Structurelessness, which ultimately may or may not apply to Abolition and the work that they're doing. But the need to grapple with these questions reminded me of that essay and the learnings that I took from that Tyranny of Structurelessness essay.
Absolutely. Yeah. The thing that stood out to me about that case study was that idea of safety. And you talked about that, how to do it safely. I mean, I can't imagine operating in secret, like trying to do this work, being committed to this work, but, obviously needing to do it in a clandestine manner and to keep everyone safe. I mean, obviously that's probably tenet number one for these folks is we've got to keep everyone alive and safe and not labeled as a terrorist. The Philippine government is labeling folks as terrorists. So yeah, I appreciated all of these case studies so much and particularly the lessons that organizers can learn from them, but also, the impact that these groups have on their participants. So one of the other case studies was about the Yo No Fui collective, and I hope I'm saying that correctly, from Argentina. Melanie Brazzell describes them as an organization that uses poetry and creative writing as a bridge to build relationships across prison walls, grounded in values of transfeminism, anti-carcerality, and popular arts and education. And their work tries to use creativity to build solidarity between incarcerated and non-incarcerated folks. And there was so much about their work that was compelling to me and really powerful in terms of being a great example of a community-based response to harm, which this whole report is about. They're bringing creative writing, arts and crafts, reading groups, restorative justice practices to groups both inside prisons and outside of prisons. And all of that has the goal of helping people rethink their assumptions about guilt and harm and violence and punishment, which is really incredible work. There were several examples in this case study that showed how participants were able to bear witness to other people's struggles and stories and also help them to understand the structural conditions that often lead people to incarceration, which, again, I think were great examples of weaving together the networks of care, support, and understanding that the folks in this conference are trying to talk about. Another powerful piece from this case study was a particular statement about what guides the collective's work. It was, quote, "For Yo No Fui, these links include a colonial legacy of indigenous genocide by Spanish settlers and a residual Catholic culture of guilt and punishment. This punitive culture continues to colonize minds and language in Argentina. The collective argues that, quote, we all have punishment in our blood." And that sentiment to me, like that idea that's something that we've talked about here before in the podcast. It's such an important thing to recognize about, when we talk about abolition, like the punishment is in our blood. And when we're doing this, we have to sort of work to dream about how we get to the place that we need to be, knowing that exists in all of us. Yeah, I'm glad you talked about one of them. I wanted to talk about another one too, because these case studies, there's so much to learn from them.
Definitely. And I think about like punishment being in our blood. It reminds me of the story about fish. Yeah. So you don't know what it is that you're in until you figure out how to see what it is you're in.
Absolutely.
Or feel it. So one of the other things that stuck out to me and reminded me of emergent strategy and what we've read from Adrienne Marie Brown and Andrea Ritchie, it reminded me of the stuff we read from them.
Yeah.
But the report said, quote, "Fungi are particularly potent symbols for those who tend to and heal violence because of their ability to break down what society deems refuse and turn it into compost hungry for new life. Fungi are decomposers. They are ecosystem creators. They are nurturers and mediators of consensual exchange and mutual aid between the plant and animal worlds. They can digest tar and waste and take what may look like a toxic or broken ecosystem and transform it into a rich environment that is hospitable to life." Isn't that what we're talking about when we're talking about transformative justice practices? So something we want you to reflect on is what you are decomposing. What are the toxins, wastes, the harmful norms that we are absorbing and transforming? And I thought that was such a powerful way for us to think about our process of creating change in ourselves.
Yes.
We talk about punishment being in our blood, and we have to recognize how are we processing it? How are we getting rid of that toxin that is present? And because we've been socialized to accept all these things, it's in our blood, as they said in Yon Fui. And how are those things harming us? So how can we break them down into something that actually works for our humanity, whether that's transformative justice practices or something else? But it's connected to what we do on the podcast. We're talking about learning and unlearning.
Yeah, absolutely.
Too. And sometimes we have to break down all of that dominant culture nonsense that we've been subjected to, that we've been swimming in, in order to make space for the liberatory thinking and processes that will help us build the world we all actually need.
Yes.
And learn about that world and unlearn the things that are holding us back from moving into that world.
Yeah. One of the things I really love about abolition and all the things that we've consumed is just the imagery. And I think in so much of the media that we've consumed, we've from books to articles to documentaries to these resources, right? The imagery of using fungi, for example, and thinking about it as toxins, waste, like all of the ways that any way that you can get people to understand what it is, right? And to buy into it, I think like, let's do it, like absolutely use it. And so, yeah, I love those questions. And the other thing that stands out to me about what you just said there was we have to recognize that it's there. And so let's recognize that it's there, and then let's ask ourselves these questions and let's figure it out and go from there. So yeah, absolutely. That's good stuff. You know, one of the other concepts that Melanie talks about early on in this report is about the abolitionist movement's connections between state violence at home and also state violence abroad, right?
Yes.
And you sort of alluded to this at the top a little bit, but she says, quote, "The contemporary abolitionist movement has always made connections between domestic and international state violence, hence the parallels between the term prison industrial complex and the older phrase it builds on, the military industrial complex. How are these two linked? The global north uses both soft power, carceral humanitarianism, and hard power, military and security, to ensure neoliberal exploitation and extraction in the rest of the world. This shakes loose a tide of migration, which rebounds to bring us the consequences of that violence abroad back home. Migrant and refugee organizing at the U.S.-Mexico border and at the frontiers of Fortress Europe have shown how carceral violence at the border aims to stem these tides. But the global south has already infiltrated the global north, and policing inside global north territories aims to control and punish migrants and people of color living in the belly of the beast of empire. Policing and the military and all the security apparatuses in between make up a continuum of racial carceral control that targets people of color across the spheres of both domestic and the foreign." You know, I think that's some really critical, spot-on analysis about, you know, just why abolition is so important, given not only the fact that violence operates in this vicious cycle, and we've talked about that, but also because of how connected violence is everywhere, right? And how violence over there impacts us and how violence here impacts there, right?
Yeah.
So the abolitionist movement really helps make all of that clear to me. And again, I appreciate your context up front about the conference participants needing to set a stage and set some commonality and some common language around how they were talking about this. But I also appreciate this context of, you know, what does violence look like and how is it all working together in a way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think about over the last week, the new violence that is happening in Lebanon from Israel, and you know the way that that's connected to abolition movements, and it's directly connected to the United States because those are weapons that the United States has sent there. So all of these things are all interconnected, and we can see it play out more and more. And it reminds me of an article we read a while back about people in 2014 seeing themselves, people in Ferguson seeing themselves in what was happening in Palestine at the time, and sharing tips across Twitter on how they could mitigate the effects of tear gas and and then seeing the same rubber bullets and the shells from those rubber bullets on Twitter in entirely different locations. But so you those see these connections,
powerful.
And you also see the connections. I think, you know, they talk about the soft power and we talk about neoliberal capitalism, and we talk about patriarchy, we talk about white supremacy. These are also all global north exports across the world that are also influencing somewhat, probably across the world, the interpersonal violence that we're experiencing too. So there's all these connections that are happening that are both real state violence, but also the influence of empire on interpersonal violence across the globe.
Absolutely.
I think all of those things are connected.
And what I think about when I think about what I shared there and what you just said, particularly the Ferguson example there and Palestine example, it's why we believe in this idea that your liberation is connected to my liberation, and my liberation is connected to your. Absolutely, right? And so like all of this is so clear to me. That's why I say the abolitionist movement makes all of this really clear for me. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so another piece that stuck out to me was this concept of time traveling through liberatory movements and recognizing the way that struggles evolve. So there's this section that says, quote, "Through prickly conversations with family members in Italy about gender and survivorship, Schmeit of US-based collective Spring Up found ways to time travel between past and present with their grandmother. Stas relayed the words of their nonna. Stas, if you were born when I was born, we would be fighting against fascism together. And if I was born when you were born and where you are, then I would be advocating for queer and trans liberation with you. This time traveling visits not only the past, but also the future for inspiration. We need to be time travelers. We don't have the context for our visions. We're not living there yet. So we have to time travel between our values in the future and our context in the present. Yes. And then we have to grow those contexts and conditions. So this work is time traveling."
I love that.
I love that metaphor of time traveling between the vision of the world we have and the current one we exist within, the vision for the world we need and the one that we exist within, because we're building these bridges between where we're at and where we need to go. And it takes some leaps of thinking and thinking outside of reality to get there.
Yes.
Because we only know what we know.
Yep. And
we know that there can be something else, but that thing doesn't exist yet. So how do we get there?
Absolutely.
And I love the idea of time traveling between the two things to try to figure out what that looks like.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that metaphor too. And excuse my friendship, we're talking about a cool ass grandma. Like,
yeah.
like I'd be there for you fighting for queer and trans liberation. Like, come on, grandma. I love it. Very good. All right. Well, why don't we shift here our conversation over to application? How does this report and our conversation about it today apply to our everyday lives and work? I think one of the major takeaways from this report is just how important it is to think about and address the intersectionality of our struggles. We were talking about this a little bit earlier. One of the things that Melanie does in this report, so many incredible things, but one of the things she does is ask some critical questions. She says, quote, "Abolitionist campaigns often combat single tentacles of the monster of state violence while pointing out its international character. But what of the many arms of our resistance, weaving together like fungi under the earth, the multitude of transformative justice projects building life-giving institutions? What links us? What shape can cross-border collaboration take today, particularly for abolitionist and transformative justice struggles?" And I think those are really great questions, and they highlight the power of transformative justice. You know, we've got to think about the state and also think beyond the state. We've got to think about and use the power of our own communities in order to create the life-giving and life-affirming support and services and resources that we need. And there's so much that we can also learn from the transnational transformative justice work that we're seeing across the globe that can help us too. And so what are the ways in which we are in community with each other beyond these borders? That's the whole point of this report. And learn from each other, support each other, and build the world that we need to see. I think those questions really are such an important takeaway from this.
Yeah, I think thinking about how this work is connected is very powerful.
Yes.
Because I think sometimes people can feel isolated and
Yeah.
you get burnt out. There's another piece of this report where they talk about one of the I forget the word they use specifically. One of the themes of transformative justice work is doing it without the resources you need to do it effectively or to
Yes.
do it well, and people alluding to people getting burnt out because they're doing this extra work
Yeah.
in addition to whatever else they might be doing. And if we're connecting the dots connecting through roots, through understanding that this is like fungi under the earth, connected across many miles, that support network, you feel it differently.
Absolutely.
Oh, I'm not alone doing this work. I might be the only person right in my local neighborhood or whatever, but I know that I can reach out to so-and-so and just talk about it and process what's going on.
Yes, there's power
and
in
find
that.
support. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's beautiful application. Mine this week comes from one of the resources sections. So this one was about a telephone helpline for people who want to change their abusive or harmful behaviors toward their partners.
Oh, yeah.
The group, called A Call for Change, quote, works with callers on undoing their patterns of control, superiority, and lack of mutual accountability to enable callers to develop new practices towards becoming a more safe, reliable partner. Which I think is a really great idea for a project, because ultimately we have all these things we need to find new ways of being outside of our patriarchal ideas of control. We have to find ways to process the toxins as fungi.
Yes.
And so, all of that is such a great idea for finding ways to support people as they're thinking about this in a different way. But the part that stood out to me most was when the report said, quote, founder Jack Patrici explained the helpline's model of compassionate, accountable conversations with persons causing harm. Compassion without accountability is collusion, and accountability without compassion is domination. We have to understand we cannot control people out of controlling others. We cannot dominate people out of dominating others.
Yes.
We cannot shame people out of shaming others.
Yes.
And that's a powerful way to put that very simply.
Yes.
Just to break down the toxins that we've taken in, where we feel the need to control, we feel the need to dominate in these interpersonal relationships, again, because of the ways that we've been socialized.
Absolutely.
Figuring out other ways to do that. You have to model the way to do that in a different way. You can't, we can't shame people. Or it's the same way that prison doesn't actually do anything. We're just punishing people for a behavior, and there's not necessarily a lot of connection between I did this thing and now I'm here. The cause and effect isn't there in the same way that it might be in a transformative justice process.
Yes, absolutely. What a powerful and beautiful mantra to guide their work. Compassion without accountability is collusion. Accountability without compassion is domination. And I love that. I love that. Yeah. Very good. Well, that's actually a perfect transition.
Great.
Let's talk about homework. What do we want to do to continue our learning and unlearning once we leave the table today? I really appreciated learning about A Call for Change, actually. And there's also another resource in that same section called the Games and Online Harassment Hotline. And both of these resources and hotlines sound like they're doing some really incredible and powerful work in their communities for the folks who utilize their services. And so my homework was I want to just learn more about what they're doing and more about their work beyond what was shared in this report. So I'm so glad you shared a little bit about A Call for Change, and I just want to learn a little bit more. How about you?
My homework is the timeline that Interrupting Criminalization created that is a history of transformative justice movements globally.
Yes, it's sort of towards the end of the report.
Yeah, they talk about this timeline that exists. And it starts in 1492 with an entry about European colonialism's violent history. And the next entry, I think, is Columbus, and then goes throughout history from there to 2020 with a defund police open letter and the signing of the Moment of Truth letter, which, quote, details the harms caused by the mainstream anti-violence movement's collaboration with law enforcement and articulates the commitment of the signatories to move into the future, divesting from the criminal legal system and in community with BIPOC leaders. So there's a lot of remarkable transformative justice history to learn about on this timeline.
Yes.
It's hard. I could not count how many things as I was scrolling through, I was like, oh, I'll grab a few things here and there. But it literally was so huge that I just got overwhelmed.
1492 is where it starts.
I'm gonna start from 14. And it I think
of course, but that's still a long
You get
timeline.
to the 40s or 50s pretty quickly from 1492, relatively speaking.
Yeah.
But then the 40s and 50s to 2020 is but pages and pages and pages and pages.
Yeah.
So it was hard to quantify how much is there, and I thought I would grab a few things here and there, but there's a lot of history, there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of work that is documented in a way here. So it looks like a really cool thing to learn more about.
What are the individual things? Let's say 1950 is there. I mean, is it articles? Is it just a sort of a brief synopsis of what took place?
It's more like a history.
Okay.
Like this thing happened here. So like the 94 crime bill is on there as an example. I saw that.
Okay.
So it's things that impacted transformative justice negatively, so to speak, but it's also people doing movement work. And it's maybe little stories about the work that they did.
Yeah, capturing all of that.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. Oh, man. Very cool. I'll check that out, too. Well, as you can tell, this was a really powerful report. I think we just scratched the surface, all that was in it. And so I'd love to also just revisit this report in general and see what more we can learn from it. But great conversation about it today, my friend. And you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I'm bringing an article from In These Times. It's called Toni Morrison on Fascism and Censorship.
Wow.
And it's not really an article.
Okay.
But a republishing of 2 essays by Toni Morrison called Peril and Racism and Fascism.
Okay.
So Peril was published in 2008 and Racism and Fascism was published in 1995. And there's a short introduction to the essays by Cheryl Barbie where she says, quote, Morrison recognizes what the creep of fascism looks like, particularly the censorship of dissent. So these are actually published in coordination with some other essays by June Jordan, which are also republished in a similar fashion on In These Times. And they talk about in both of the introductions, because I was trying to decide which one of these things to bring, June Jordan or Toni Morrison. And they talk about in both of the introductions to the 2 pieces that they're republishing that they were part of a group that would meet regularly in New York City.
Oh, wow.
They would meet regularly and talk about the work that they were doing, but also how they're contributing to social justice stuff, if I recall correctly about the
very cool
from that synopsis introduction article. So I've skimmed them a little bit. They look like really great essays to reflect upon, especially things that we're a little bit removed from now, but it'll be interesting to read from her perspective from 95 and 2008 how those things are still connected to us today.
Absolutely. I mean, I have no doubt that there's still some application of her work, of her incredible work to today. And yeah, talk about a tough choice picking between those 2. But Toni Morrison is incredible. So bravo, my friend.
I mean, you
can't go wrong. I'm excited. I'm excited for them. Very good. All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram and TikTok. Check us out over on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.